The Unconventional Therapist's Guide to Nothing.
Hey everyone, we are the Unconventional Therapists, and this is your guide to nothing, where every week we take a topic, theme, or thing, overanalyze it, and make it all make sense in the scheme of life, living, and mental health. My name is Dave. I am joined here with my co-host, Greg. That's it.
Oh, yeah, because you're coming out somber, because this is a somber one, and we already feel pretty uncomfortable about the subject matter. Is that what's going on here?
Sure.
And
I just don't, I feel like it's tactless to make the joke I was going to make.
Oh, well, then you're probably right.
So I decided to hold it inside.
Okay.
Bottle it up, right?
Yeah,
Isn't that what you tell your patients?
Every single one of them. Just
bottle up your emotions.
Lock it down, push it down.
Never talk about them.
It's all going to work out.
Yeah.
So this is a little bit of a sensitive subject because especially we are men, Dave, or the closest thing to it. So the idea is we might not know everything about this. So it's important that we preface that. And I'll say that again later on. But I think the most important thing about this subject is to get rid of the stigma, bring it to the forefront as much as we possibly can.
So essentially, we're just two man boys sitting here tackling the toughest subject we could ever do in the best way we ever could.
That's it. That's all we are, and that's all we can do. And it's important. It's important because, well, let's just get into it. I think locally, we all know that recently, police responded to a Duxbury home and discovered 3 children unconscious. They had been strangled to death in a murder-suicide attempt. So part of why this was able to happen is that the disorder we're going to be talking about is so stigmatized. The nature of postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis is what we're trying to do here is break the stigma, and that requires that we bring it out into the open and talk about it. So as heavy as this is, Dave, I think it's important that we give it a shot.
I also think, Greg, that it's heavy. There's stigma, but also I think it's kind of unknown. I've never heard the term postpartum psychosis until you said, hey, there's this thing going on in the news. Why don't you actually watch the news for once? I was like, oh, okay, let me check out what's going on in the real world.
Yeah. Stop like snipping your bonsai tree or whatever like hippie stuff you do that keeps you
They're succulents. I water the succulents.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
On a weekly basis. It keeps them good.
Yeah, and then when I'm in the office for a half hour, one of those leaves falls off every single time, and I feel terrible.
Oh, that's you're the one doing that.
Okay. It's just my presence that's doing it. I don't know what that means. All right. Well, let's get into this postpartum depression. So, up to 20% of women experience postpartum depression, so it's not rare at all. And I was going to say that 0 men experience it as a little joke, but that's actually not true.
You're a liar.
I'm a liar. About 10% of men can experience this too, but I think that almost takes away from the severity of it.
I think, but none of them would admit it because they would all feel embarrassed for trying to take the spotlight off of the fact that their wife just pushed a baby out of them.
Yeah, and you're like, well, I'm a little sad too. It's like, just leave it alone.
Yeah.
This is the time to bottle it up.
Well, that kind of explains the sympathy weight, right?
Well, yeah, I'm still putting on mine.
If you got the blues, you're maybe eating a little bit more.
It's interesting that you say blues because we'll talk about that. But something interesting here, Dave, is, and we know this going through all these classes, it's a specifier of depression. It's not its own diagnosis. And I think that in and of itself is a problem. Like if you think about some of the specifiers of depression, like SAD, SAD, which is very difficult, and we've talked about it, but I feel like postpartum depression rises to a higher level. I mean, it's an experience like birth. It can induce a variety of emotions: joy, fear, anxiety, and definitely depression, which when I think about it must be extremely difficult because everyone around you seems to think or acts like you should be in complete joy, like having the time of your life. And if you're not, that feels really bad.
Yeah. Well, I think that was probably actually, maybe I'm wrong about this, but like from my point of view, I kind of feel like that's maybe like an old school kind of thought, like that, because I think we are more aware of the depression aspect of, the whole process. And I think that that's a little bit more like the anxiety that moms must feel. I think a lot of us have more understanding of that than maybe like we wanted to admit previously. Because you're right. It was always like that. Oh, you're glowing and like all that stuff. And now it's more like, I think people understand now a little bit better, like what that process must be like for a new mom.
Yeah, I think we're trying to. And there's a lot more support, but still nowhere near enough. But I think still, though, even, probably parents and grandparents, if you have a baby and the baby's healthy, it's like, oh, you're so lucky. Everything's so perfect. The baby's perfect. Everything's great. And you just feel like, well, why don't I feel great? And the first, I would say, diagnosis, even though it's not actually a diagnosis, is baby blues, they call it. And this is something that can last a couple of weeks, a few days, maybe a month after birth. And this is just your mood swings, anxiety, sadness, irritability, feeling overwhelmed.
And this is totally normal.
Well, it's still technically it's all totally normal, right? You feel how you feel, but this is when it's like creeping. As a couple of weeks go by, it's starting to creep. It might be causing a little more stress than necessary. But trouble sleeping, appetite problems. That's how do you avoid that with a brand new baby? That's the difficult thing to kind of understand.
Yeah.
So, and postpartum depression, and I'm not going to beat the symptoms to death with this because the symptoms are going to be fairly close to depression, minus this feeling that it's difficult to bond with your baby, or you might have thoughts of hurting your baby, or you're not connecting with your baby, you're not feeling close enough. Irritability, anger, hopelessness, feelings of worthlessness, withdrawing into your family, withdrawing into yourself, just not wanting to be around the baby. Like these sort of feelings, which have got to be, that's got to be tough, right? Just to have this brand new baby and not feel like you're connecting with it good enough.
Yeah.
I can only imagine how difficult that'd be. Obviously, I have no idea, but I can try to empathize. That's what we do.
Yeah. It's an interesting thought because you think about what the anticipation of being pregnant, holding on to that baby for that period of, 9 months, or if it's sooner or if it's a little after, you think about what that anticipation must build. It's hard to think that during that 9 months, you're not thinking about what your bond's going to be like.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you're nervous. Maybe you're scared that the bond's not going to be there. Or maybe you're thinking, I'm going to have the best bond ever. My child's going to love me. I would love to hear actual moms tell me, like, what were your thoughts during pregnancy about how you were going to bond with your child, and did it match?
Yeah. So
I would love to hear actually someone who didn't experience baby blues or postpartum depression.
That's a great, that's the point, kind of, right?
To kind of get like, what do pregnant moms think about when it comes to that stuff?
And then, so you feel bad is not a good thing. You feel good, they get worried too. And I'll explain why. The real danger, postpartum depression can last a long time. It can last even up to a year, and maybe even longer. But the dangerous things happen, more dangerous things happen, I should say, with postpartum psychosis.
So, Greg, before you get to postpartum psychosis,
okay,
you mentioned something about the thoughts.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to highlight what those thoughts are again, because this reminded me of our episode about OCD.
Sure.
And what you were talking about with the negative thoughts that can come up, like those thoughts like, suddenly I want to punch this person in the face and I know I shouldn't do that, but I'm so afraid I'm going to do it. What is that highlighting? So when you think about these thoughts a mom's having, they're afraid they're going to do something that's going to hurt their child. They're afraid they're going to throw their baby. They're going to drop their baby. What do all those things highlight about the mom?
Their values and how much they care about their baby.
Yes, they are so nervous about harming this child because they love this child in their mind. And that's like the funny thing about thoughts is they like, if we just take them for surface level, we misinterpret the meaning of the thoughts. And that's why we have to actually say them out loud sometimes and talk to somebody about them.
Right. And that's the thing that's difficult too. And that's where the stigma comes in. It's difficult for a mom to talk to anyone and say, hey, I really hope this isn't true, but I'm having these feelings and these thoughts about hurting the baby, or I can't connect with my baby, and I'm afraid I'm going to harm the baby. Who can they say that to? You can't say. Then you're going to start thinking, well, is DCYF going to get involved, or is my family going to think less of me? Are they going to take this baby away from me? But in reality, those thoughts are coming from a place like it's evolutionary. These feelings are being turned into language that's strong enough for your brain's trying to send you a message: protect this baby at all costs. Right. So it's sending you this message like you're afraid this baby is going to get hurt, and you're interpreting it as I'm going to hurt this baby through your own thoughts, playing these horrible tricks on you. Yeah. And that, you're right, that's something we see with OCD. That's something we see sometimes with just anxiety in general.
Well, and that's another thing I was going to point out, because like I do have some patients that are moms, and they've talked to me about this fear they have of that they're a bad mom. And often, I mean, it's often untrue. It's almost always untrue. Let me just put it that way. The fact that they're even talking to me about it is exactly in line with what we're talking about here. Right. They're talking about it with me because it's a fear they have because they love their child and they don't want to be a bad mom, which already kind of makes them not a bad mom.
It's like, yeah, you can't be doing the same thing. Yeah. If you're worried about whether or not you're a good mom, guess what? You're a good mom.
Yeah. Exactly. Because you're doing things to prevent yourself from being a bad mom. So those two things can't exist at the same time. I have one patient who had some early onset like disruption with her caregiver. So I think there was some DCYF involvement when she was really young. She kind of has this like ongoing anxious attachment with her child that she's going to do something wrong and her child's going to get taken away. It causes her to hyper focus on every step, everything that she does, worrying that my child's going to get taken away. And it's the smallest thing sometimes. And I like, it's so hard for me to sit there sometimes and be like, there's no way a child would ever get, taken away from you because
we see that all the time.
A bad lunch or something to daycare or something like.
Oh, you wrote a joke in the lunchbox and it was just a terrible one.
Right. Or somebody insulted your parenting, or they commented on your parenting. It would be like even that. And we all know in society how judgmental everybody is about parenting styles, which is so ridiculous, because it's like, if you're not being abusive and you're not doing something harmful to your child, mind your business, right?
Yeah, if you're trying your best, then you're on the right path. Yeah. I think that's basically what it comes down to. Because we talk to, especially you, Dave, you talk to a lot of little kids, and I think that you would agree with the kids that I talk to, a lot of them, all they want is a parent who just want to try their best.
Yeah.
I mean, a mother that would try her best. That's like a dream to so many children. And if you're afraid you're not doing well enough as a mother, and you're trying your best, you're doing it. Just keep doing that. It's a beautiful thing.
Exactly. Yep. So I just wanted to kind of highlight the thought process that goes in, because I hear it all the time. It is something that I think it's based in, this whole idea of what we're talking about as far as, like the feelings that a new mom gets after pregnancy, but it's also kind of influenced heavily by that judgment from society, I think, too. So it's like external and internal at the same time.
1,000%. And that thought stuff. I mean, even want to get back to the Catholic stuff, somehow we managed to squeeze that in. I remember being a kid and going to confession, my first confession, and not having a whole, like, I didn't really, what was I doing? Right.
You ever make up? Make up sins?
So, well, what they told me was, do you ever think any bad thoughts? And I'm like, oh, geez, well, now we're going to be here all night, because I didn't realize that what you thought could be used as a sin. And that's just not fair. And also not true. You think what you think, that you can't change what you think. You don't have a choice to have these thoughts. No one's asking for these intrusive thoughts. They happen. And what you do with them afterwards is all you have control over. Yeah. Diving back in, postpartum psychosis. This is when things are getting a little bit more difficult. So you could feel confused and lost, have obsessive thoughts about your baby, kind of talking about that, hallucinating and having delusions, a lot of sleep problems, which are going to be there anyway, and certainly don't help the situation. Having too much energy, feeling paranoid, and making attempts to harm yourself or the baby, which is a little confusing because when we're going to have to explain psychosis a little bit and what might be going on there. So another thing that the Mayo Clinic doesn't mention in their symptoms is, and I've had the opportunity to talk to a couple moms, and maybe I've been given permission not to share their names, but to tell some of their story. And in both cases, what the first thing they noticed before slipping into a postpartum psychosis was they felt bliss and they felt joy and they felt like they were connecting perfectly with their baby and they had everything figured out.
So
And
they're elevated.
so they're super elevated. And when we see that, that's what we really see with psychosis. We don't see it sometimes feels egocentric. It feels good. It feels like everything makes sense. And sometimes this is the first step in postpartum psychosis.
Right. So with that, with the postpartum depression, it's ego dystonic.
Mm-hmm.
So we're afraid of our own thoughts. We realize our thoughts are off, right?
And which is actually safe.
We're aware of that. And so that's important to recognize. With the psychosis, it's egocentric, like Greg said. So this is their reality. This is, they believe what they're experiencing is reality. And also, you're mentioning the elevated mood that happens kind of before, we get to the more serious stuff. That's interesting because one of the big factors for someone to be predisposed to postpartum psychosis is having a family history of bipolar.
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about
obviously
that too.
You would have the mania, or they've had a previous psychotic episode. I do think it's important because we're talking about this just to kind of recognize, though, it's not the most common thing. I think it happens from to maybe one. I think the stat was 1 to 2 mothers out of every 1,000 deliveries or something along those lines.
So yeah, that's kind of, I guess it's all about perspective on that, because I read the same number and I'm kind of thinking it's not that rare. Because
if you give it a percentage, it was a super low percentage. Yeah, so I don't know. It's an interesting thing.
So 1 out of every 500 births.
Sure. Or it was 1 to 2, so I don't know. It's somewhere in there. The other part of this, though, stat wise, it suggests that there's approximately 5% suicide rate and a 4% infanticide.
Yeah,
right?
Infanticide.
Infanticide. Are you sure it was that?
I am, unfortunately.
So that's the rate associated with the illness, which isn't great.
No, it's not great. And this happens, especially the psychosis can really start to gain traction. It's important to nip this in the bud if you can, as early as possible. But remember, the first sign can be you're feeling really good, you're overjoyed, you're doing a great job. When you go to the doctors to talk about how, and we're going to talk about how this is ridiculous. There's only one check-in after a ton of prenatal care, and after birth, there's not enough at all. But we'll get into that a little bit. But what are you going to say at this point, at this stage of psychosis? Oh yeah, I feel great. Everything's going perfect. My baby's perfect. And I think we're connecting beautifully. I mean, are you going to tell them you feel too good? Are you going to tell them you're too confident of a mother? It's just it's a dangerous place.
I wonder how
undetected.
Yeah. And if you're feeling good, you're not thinking something's wrong. So how would you report that?
So you have to wait till it progresses. And maybe somebody else.
Hopefully somebody else is noticing that you seem off and they're able to kind of facilitate that.
Yeah. So it's not to say that a deep depressive state couldn't induce psychosis as well, but I think it's much more likely in the manic states. And the dangers with the break from reality are real. I mean, voices, delusions, and hallucinations. Dave, just like we talked about in the schizophrenia episode, most of the time it's command hallucinations. And it's always invasive and scary. It's never going to be this sweet voices that you're hearing that are very comforting and lulling you to sleep. It's always very threatening. And that's very spooky and scary. And who can you tell? Especially if this harmful voice it's who are you going to tell as a mother? Who can you report this stuff to if you're not sure what's going on? And that's, again, why the stigma creates a dangerous situation. And that's what allows us dopey men to even attempt to talk about this.
Sure.
We have to. Everyone should, right? We have to. All right, Dave, let's talk a little bit about depression and bipolar and the importance of keeping up with your mental health beforehand.
One of the things that's a really big issue and can lead to the onset of the postpartum psychosis is sleep.
Okay.
And I think that's a very important thing for us to kind of recognize. It's one of the two things that felt the most important for me to kind of recognize as being big challenges. Because when you think about sleep and you think about a newborn, you probably aren't thinking that sleep is going to be good. And Greg, you would probably know this because you have 20 kids, and that's 20 times your sleep has been interrupted, right?
I haven't gotten 8 hours sleep in 17 years.
Sure. So what is considered to be enough sleep if you are a new parent?
I don't know.
I think one thing we can say is obviously some sleep is needed.
Yeah,
right?
Try that.
And I think it's important to just for people to be aware of that like sleep deprivation can lead to something like this, like postpartum depression, like any sort of mental health. It would be that way if you didn't have a new child. So why would it be any different with a new child, right?
Yeah, it's just, what's the answer to that? A strong partner? Like, what if you don't have someone
right? Exactly.
to help? It's it puts you in this really tough spot because, like you said, you cannot have a newborn and get a good night's sleep. You just cannot.
No. The other part of this that feels almost like there's no answer for it specifically is the fact that people who are on medication, specifically, what kind of medication is it? Mood stabilizers. I'm sorry. Mood stabilizer medications. There's a likelihood that like might want to stop taking the mood stabilizer during pregnancy because of the effect it can have on the unborn baby, right? So it can lead to like some kind of abnormalities or some kind of birth issues. So that might cause you to go off your medication. Therefore, you are now an unmedicated person with some sort of mental health issue that made you go on the mood stabilizer, which is totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But you made the conscious choice to not take the mood stabilizer during pregnancy for the sake of the baby's health, which is totally responsible and okay as well. But now you're unmedicated. You just had a baby. You're super stressed out. Your body has gone through all these changes. And now what?
It puts you in an almost impossible situation. It can create a perfect storm. And that's why if you have had depression or especially bipolar, well, if you've experienced depression historically at all, it would be good to know if it was, unipolar depression or bipolar depression. Because like Dave's talking about, those are two very different classes of medications. For one thing, you could probably get away with taking the SSRIs or the depression medication while you're pregnant in most cases. But if you're required to be on mood stabilizers or antipsychotics, that's probably not going to work out. And sometimes it's not as easy as you would think to know if someone is or has bipolar, because oftentimes, like we said, you won't usually see them until they're in a depressed state. So they might just get the SSRIs and go and give birth and not know the whole time that they could have been entering a manic state. So it's very important to have your mental health under control before, I guess, and who are we to say, like, how can you say that, you should be taking care of your mental health? We just always think you should be taking care of your mental health for sure. But I think it needs to be more a part of prenatal care than it is right now, like a huge part.
When we did our bipolar episode, our stat for people's who have bipolar, they could have, what was it, like 1 to 2 manic episodes in a lifetime or something like that. So like, there's a chance you never had a manic episode, but you have bipolar and you might not even.
Well, maybe you have bipolar, you never had a manic episode, but now we throw on this incredible trauma of pregnancy and birth. We throw on sleep deprivation.
Yeah.
and stress and pressure. And guess what? And here's your maniac served up. It has to be.
Right. And back to the idea of the medication, I wanted to point this out too. So just because you have the baby doesn't mean you immediately go back on your mood stabilizers, because also now you're breastfeeding and you don't want to take the mood stabilizer while you're breastfeeding for the same reason as before. It can be transmitted in the breast milk. So you can't just hop back on your medication in the time where you probably need it most.
And these decisions are typically being made without the help of mental health professionals or your doctor, because again, like I said, you're in prenatal care. You're seeing the doctor often when before you give birth, but after you give birth, not nearly enough. I think there's one mental health check-in, and that is disturbing.
Yeah, because how many people are going to go into that one mental health check-in and be like, I had all these terrible thoughts.
Well, you know how those things go too with the primary care physician or the obstetrician. They're going to say, "Hey, have you thought of killing yourself? Are you okay?" And they're going to say yes. That's going to be the extent of your mental health check. You've been to the doctor, Dave, I imagine.
I have gone almost every year of my life.
Oh wow, I haven't been in a long time. God knows what's going on inside my body. So let's talk about risk factors for this. Obviously, prenatal mental health is incredibly important, especially bipolar. That's going to be a thing. The environment, the relationship you're in, Dave, that's going to play a huge role, right?
Yep.
The trauma of the birth. What was the pregnancy like? History of mood disorders in the family, like you said. What if the baby has any problems? What if the baby has health problems? What if you're having trouble breastfeeding? What if you have multiple births? What if you have twins or triplets, God forbid? There's obviously a ton of hormonal changes that can mimic depression, the sleep deprivation. It's just the most stressful thing ever, I can imagine. I remember when I had my first baby, the doctor was a Vietnam war doctor. And he told me that after seeing everything he saw there, the first 3 months of his first child's life was the most stressful thing he's ever been through.
Oh boy.
And I think he meant it. He meant it. And look, it's hard. It's hard. Sleep deprivation in and of itself is difficult. And if you're woken up by screaming, I mean, that's hard. So when should people get help, Dave?
As soon as possible.
Exactly. I almost feel just get help. I don't even wait for symptoms. You should just automatically get help after you give birth. Get some support. The prenatal care is great. We're all big fans of that. But after birth, it's arguably more important to get the check-ins then. That's when everything's hitting the fan, as they say.
Well, the prenatal birth oversight seems like it's for the baby. The post-birth check-ins feel like they're for the mom just as much as the baby.
1,000%. But in light of recent events and those statistics you provided earlier, those dark statistics with the suicide and the infanticide, it's for everybody. Yeah. It's for the well-being of society as a whole, because this takes us back a peg when tragedies like this happen. Dave, if you don't mind, I can share just a short narrative that I have from a patient that I worked with, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about it. So when she came home, she felt euphoric. She felt great. Everything was going well. She thought she connected great with the baby, and the husband was happy. He went back to work a little earlier than he was going to because it just felt like things were going so well. It was like she felt like Mary Poppins, And she started to get paranoid when her own grandparents were around. And she eventually accused the grandmother of molesting and drugging the baby. And like you've talked about before with psychosis, she's sure this is happening. She's not this is a little wishy-washy about this. She's sure this is happening. And she was so confident that she convinced her husband. The husband and her, they had the kids tested, and all this was unfounded. Time went on. She felt drugged. And you can imagine how the relationship with the grandparents changed after that. But she felt drugged, and she called 911, and that was unfounded too. She thought her husband was cheating. I mean, I shouldn't say she thought. She knew her husband was cheating with the nurses that were helping with the baby. She knew. And it turned out that wasn't true either. So now she's really kind of spiraling, and she's starting to get the auditory and visual hallucinations. She hears mumbling. She's obviously paranoid about tons of things. She thinks that people in the TV are watching her through her TV. And she was lucky. And the reason why she was lucky and she managed to get help is because her husband was super supportive, for one thing. But the other part about it was she talked about it. She kept bringing this stuff up, which is typically not what people do. People aren't usually like, I think people are talking to me through the TV. I think grandma's molesting the baby. They kind of hold this inside it. They're like, am I going crazy? Is this really happening? And the fact that maybe she was deep into the psychosis, it could be what saved her. And she's a huge advocate now for mothers. So, I mean, it's really an intense situation.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah, it's intense. Dave, we may have brought this the short story up before in the past. Do you know anything about the yellow wallpaper story?
I brought it up in like 2 episodes already.
Okay.
Yeah. I think we brought it up in, actually, oddly enough, I feel like it was one of the ones like 7 Deadly Sins or something like that. We were talking about just people. Oh, we were talking about gaslighting.
Okay, that's perfect, actually. And the story, for those of us who this might be their first episode, a husband isolates his wife, and she creates her own lonely, deep, psychotic depression, and reality and unreality sort of merge for her. And I think this story, we should have just pointed this story out in this episode because it's written by a woman, and this story is about postpartum, and the story is written in 1892, and how men treat the illness that they can't fully understand. And I wanted to make clear, Dave, that we are fully aware that we are men, and we could never fully understand this situation either. But I think it's important to pull a shroud of stigma off of this subject and, shine it in the light a little bit.
Sure. So, and, thinking about other pop culture references, I think that this topic has been getting more and more spotlight. And I think that sometimes we'll see it in what can be kind of a scary way. Like I can think of 10 horror movies off the top of my head that now that I know of what postpartum psychosis is, were based on postpartum psychosis. And it's kind of interesting now for me to like think back about the narratives of those stories. And I just think it's interesting because it wasn't something I was super familiar with. Why aren't we super familiar with that?
Listen, we avoid these. We usually create a monster for this kind of stuff.
Yeah. We actively have people telling stories about this and making, creating films and writing novels about this stuff. Yet it feels so unspoken about. So that should change. Unfortunately, it always takes a really negative situation for change to actually happen, as we know. Like way too many times in our history, we have, it takes a shooting or, something like the nature of this, the narrative that you gave at the beginning of this about the woman from Duxbury, Mass. It takes something like that for people to even start talking about these things.
Well, we can see how society has made a shift at this point. When you think about, do you remember the Andrea Tate case? The mother.
The name sounds very familiar.
I think I don't know exactly what happened, but she had her kids in the car and she like drove off a cliff or into a river or something like that.
Yes. I do know that one.
This was probably in the 90s. Survived. Yes, she did.
I know that one. It was like a lake or something like that, I believe, if I could be wrong. But yes, I do know that one.
So when you think about the public's reaction to that, it was, obviously horror, but they were like burn her, kill her.
So
and this is a lot different situation.
It's such a hard thing, Greg, though. And like,
I know.
This is a case where like normally I feel like our roles would be flipped and you would be like, have a really harsh opinion about it. And I'd be like, well, but like, I'm actually now like, well, how do you let someone off the hook because they didn't take care of themselves? You can't let them off the hook.
No, you can't.
Obviously, you have to hold them accountable and responsible, but also understand. And I guess maybe that will influence like the course of action after of what happens to that person, knowing that this is something that they could have been going through.
I don't think it's a let it off the hook situation. I think it's let's understand how this situation happened in reality. Let's not just make this person a monster right away. Look, I know it's difficult, and I don't think that anybody should get away with this. I'm very into existentialism. I think what you do is what you do, and you have to be punished for the choices that you make, whether or not you're. Well, I guess that brings up an interesting question. When you're in the throes of psychotic break, what is your culpability for murder, Dave? I mean, I pass that to you.
It's a tough question because,
and it certainly changes when it's children.
Yeah.
I mean, remember we talked about Woodmansee, we talked about Craig Bryce, and we had no remorse. And I feel the same way here. And I just want to understand what happened in the brain so that this could be prevented in the future. And I want to make sure that mothers are getting the treatment they need after birth as well as before.
Yeah.
But you can't let this off the hook.
I think what we can do is what you had said in the beginning, and I think taking it even a little step further. I think what we can do, though, we can still be outraged. We can still be shocked. We should still follow through with accountability and responsibility on those people's ends. Mm-hmm. I think what we can stop doing, though, is making those people into these supervillains, acting as if they have some kind of special powers that make them so heartless and so cold, and understand that there's actually something really wrong with their mental health that has led them to the actions they do. It's almost like we turn these people into like these super villains in society, and that as if that's what they were put on this earth for, but that's not the case. They didn't choose their biology. They didn't choose their mental health issues. Some of them have made choices that, and those people I think are different than what we're talking about here. But when we're talking about people who have like severe mental health issues, I think it's like we have to stop making it seem like everything they've done was completely and solely by choice.
Well, if we make monsters of them, it gives us distance from them, and we can go to bed at night thinking that person was a monster. That could never happen to me or anyone in my family because they're a monster and I'm not.
Right.
It's a lot harder to look at them and say, oh, wow, this person had bipolar their whole life. This person suffered from depression. This person had some relatable mental health disorders, and things got really out of hand, and she broke into a psychotic break. And this could happen to a regular person. And that's a lot scarier than making them a monster.
Yeah.
Understanding that we all have the potential to be a monster is the real fear.
You say that, Greg, but then you and I sit across from people every day wondering at what point they could go that way. And we don't want that for our patients. And we always think of them in the highest regard. But we do always have to question, like, all right, well, how far can this go before it gets really bad and we have to like do something different than what we're doing now? Like, those people that come in and it's like, I'm just not seeing the progress I was hoping for.
Yeah,
and it feels today like things might even be a little worse than it was last time. We're constantly judging that so that we can hopefully head something off before it gets too serious. And we do that because we want to understand, we want to help, and we want to prevent those kind of things. So I think there's a difference. Those people that want to just villainize so they can and create monsters so they can put their heads down, for me, that doesn't sit right with just the way that I view the world and how we all have to be active participants in helping the world be a safer place and be a better place, right?
Well, not everyone's going to do that.
Sucks.
It does suck. It does suck because that's what's hard. Because when you look at that person and you see what they could do, you have to look at yourself and see what you can do. I mean, it's very scary. And I think the best thing that you can do, Dave, is you're talking about a feeling, and sometimes we have to trust our guts as people who work in the mental health field, as a family member. If you feel like something's off, reach out and get the help that you think someone needs before things get out of hand.
I know this is probably a comment for a totally different time, but I've had this thought recently because I've had a few conversations that were pretty intense. And you know how the other thing that we do is we make a monster out of the person, but then we reflect on all those early warning signs that were missed by the teachers and by the parents and by the professionals. It's so much harder than that, though.
Yeah.
Because a kid doesn't just, or a person doesn't just say a thing and then we're like, oh my God, I got to go tell someone and we got to stop. Like, it's usually within the context of like that person's personality. So sometimes you kind of just hear it. I'm not going to say you disregard important things sometimes, but you don't always assume that just because they said that, it's going to lead to this terrible event down the road. You know what I mean?
100%. Like, how are you going to know? And sometimes if we're going to do something, or we're going to make a call, or we're going to, if it's a young mother, or if it's a kid you're worried about, or even, whoever, if you make the wrong call, either way, you're changing their life.
And you're making it worse. In some ways. If you made the wrong call, you now just probably ruined your therapeutic relationship with that person, which possibly could have been beneficial to, helping them with whatever's going on. It's when when you make that call that like things have changed at that point. So you
might have ruined their relationship with the mental health field in general.
And that could lead to other issues.
Especially if they spend some time hospitalized. That's never. We've come a long way from the asylums of old, but it's still no picnic.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, a little bit of a tangent. Sorry about that, but it just felt like it was kind of in the line with what we were just talking about at the end. So.
Yeah, a little bit heavier than usual. Not as many laughs. If there's, but thought it was topical and important and deserved a shot. So hopefully we didn't offend anybody, and we did our best. And if you are liking these episodes, please leave a review or rate our podcast, please. Is that right? Is that right, Dave? Is that how you say it?
Sounds about right.
Yeah, that would be good. We would appreciate that.
Yes. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We will be back next week with a new episode, new vibe.
A different vibe. We'll go with a different vibe.
Depends who's picking the episode, so we'll see. All right, everybody, have a great night. Thank you for listening. We appreciate you. Be safe.
Good night.